Cool, welcome to Cloud Unplugged, and thanks for coming here. We're going to talk about open source, the big, the bad, and the ugly, but also positives, not all negatives. But before we get into it, do you want to introduce yourselves and, I guess, how we all know each other, because we all know each other. Mark?
Hi, Mark Hughes. I'm the product engineering manager at Appvia, looking after Wayfinder, and my long and storied background in software has gone through many years at a big financial services institution, doing kind of development, leading teams, seeing the good, the bad, and the very ugly of large enterprise IT, and now luckily working at a smaller company where we get to do things more agile and more fun, and get things shipped faster. But it's, the contrast between those has been a very interesting thing.
That wasn't a dig at Appvia there when you said the very ugly, because you kind of like teamed at the very ugly. Just to contrast,
absolutely. The very ugly may have been a reference to the over-process heavy large organization situation from previously.
And Lewis?
I'm Mark's work wife.
Oh, really?
I've known Mark forever. Well, a decade and a half at least. I brought him into the Appvia thing, and I've known you for nearly a decade, maybe. I don't know, quite a while. I've always worked in development at pharmaceuticals and many engineering firms on the DevOpsy sort of side. It used to be called sysadmins.
But rebranded.
But rebranded many times, and found that I really do enjoy the development after all. And now I work for Mark, and as a small part founder of the Appvia thing with yourself, John. That's cool. Me.
And so we were obviously chatting before about open source and talking about it as a bit of a talking point. Obviously, we do open source, use open source. It's kind of everywhere. And then really this conversation kind of came about of us kind of having a few drinks and then talking about how insane in some ways it really is to have so much open source in the mix and it underpin critical systems everywhere. Everything's built off of it, everything's using it, things on your devices on your wrist and phones in your pocket and cars and everything, right? And actually, how insane in some ways that is, because nobody really fully owns it, but it's kind of everywhere at the same time, and no one single person's accountable, and something could happen to it at any point. But we just kind of carry on using it, and it's all fine. And isn't that a little bit bizarre?
It's sort of fine until it isn't. And there's obviously the two models out there for in the open source world are the kind of huge companies supporting open source to a self-interested degree, but the world benefits from it, and that's cool. You've got a company, but then they suddenly choose to change the licensing model of their open source, and you realize it wasn't perhaps quite as open as you thought it was. And then on the flip side, you've got half the software in the world built on top of a library supported by one random guy in Nebraska, as the famous XKCD comic puts it, or someone in Russia who's been, supporting this open source library for many years and now can't get funding to do it anymore because of the political situation. And it makes you realize that some of these things are very fragile, and why are companies really paying back into it, or are they just using it and moving on?
And the level of trust, implicit trust, I suppose, on the oversight, I guess, because it's in the public domain and there's a community or perceived community behind things, that you might believe that somebody else must have also read the code, presumably, because it's open. So
Are you talking about supply chain?
Kind of supply chain, but just more, maybe a little bit more the psychological assumptions you can kind of make on, like, well, maybe I don't need to read all the code because it's public. So at some point, somebody surely must have done, right? So therefore, I'm just going to use it because, like, somebody else would have spotted something if it's wrong. And there's like,
you've just vendored 1 million lines of code from GitHub into your Go repo, and
yeah.
Do you read those 1 million lines? Perhaps not every single one of them. It's
almost certainly not. And nearly all software, whether it would be open source or not, most commercial software is built on and uses open source libraries for 90% of the actual functionality given. I mean, everything's standing on the shoulders of giants, all the way down to the kernel. everything that's contributed to the operating systems, containers, the software that orchestrates them, and the software supply chain of your application as well.
So do you think like companies like Tesla and the car manufacturing companies, things that have like high risk on something going wrong, like potential risk to life even, they are validating all of that supply chain? Like, what do you think their process is? I mean, I'm just saying things because I have no idea because I don't work there and it's not a domain I really know. I know there's like the frameworks around attestations and signing, but I'm not too sure about validating the code itself from things you're pulling in.
I think there's more about functional validation and having software engineering practices for critical systems in play there. Supply chain is important, and whether anybody can really do a great job, I guess you draw a line in the sand and you have an asset that you do sign, and you use those capabilities and say, okay, we're built on that.
Yeah.
And then you move forward. But to really know, how long a game can people play with regards to maybe slightly insinuous use of on that supply chain.
Yeah, I don't really know much about how they mitigate the risk of those things, like whether they've thought that through, where they put other controls in place. I don't know, like in their own code somehow. I honestly, like, I just have no idea about some of this stuff. But it's really interesting to think that you could have something that, like, if anything went wrong there,
I suppose that's to do with the functional. Will it go wrong? And for critical systems, you have more than one implementation.
And tests of your thing.
But it would not just test, but you also have voting for real time, and you have more than one system doing that thing and more than one hardware stack. When it gets really critical in space systems and things, you literally have a couple of implementations, or an odd number, ideally, voting to decide when quorum to decide when things happen. But I guess that's all of that could or couldn't be affected by supply chain, but it doesn't necessarily speak, because what we're talking about is trust here, and whether you trust the software not just to do what it's meant to, but not to do what it's not meant to do is probably more important, because it's more to do with security when you're worried about supply chain.
Yeah, true.
And I think there's that kind of, even if in the ideal case where you add a new dependency, you review the code because you're very cautious about it, you might have some static code analysis tools you use to but obviously every time that dependency is updated, you need to do that again. Now there's tooling that can help with that, but again, it's a huge amount of code that's getting pulled in. And in the sort of more critical, sort of business critical or safety critical applications, you can obviously wrap functional tests around it. Does it work? I upgraded it. Does it still work? But it doesn't tell you, does it still work? But it also sent some packets where it shouldn't have done.
Absolutely.
Did it work, but exfiltrate some data in a way it wasn't supposed to? And then you get into the security of the environment it's running in and all those sorts of things. You start layering that in. But again, I don't know how much of that is specific to open source, because all of those things are true of any dependency. The benefit really of open source is that you could do that static analysis of the code, which you couldn't do if it was just a closed library, just a jar file or whatever, DLL in the olden days, that you vendor it in the built thing, and then you've got no idea what it's doing. So at least you've got that opportunity with open source to get in there and find out, look at it yourself or put your tools on it.
Yeah, I guess it's open. The code is open. Whether someone's ever fully examined it in detail, who knows fully. If anyone has full oversight of it all. Also, the maintainers, do you really know they are? How do you trust the maintainers even of the thing is the other question, because it could be a tiny thing that you're like, well, this is barely anything.
That seems like a really common pattern at the moment. You're seeing what seemed like quite large open source projects, like having issues open saying, help us maintain this thing, you know, and where you've got that very small group of people, how much reliance and how much of your code that you're building on top of that or infrastructure you're building using that, are you relying on a small group, often of people who are volunteering their time to maintain these things? There's kind of an industry problem there about how we get maintenance of these things that we're depending on. Companies aren't great at contributing engineer time for that or donating to projects to pay people to do those things. So which amplifies the risk, because then if you've only got a very small number of individuals involved, it's risky that the software might just disappear, but it's also risky that those individuals might do something nefarious and there isn't the oversight from a larger group of maintainers who may notice that they've done something they shouldn't have done that. So there's inherent risks all over the place with that.
I guess there's two types of nefarious behaviours that you want to worry about. One is it will try and do something that you didn't want it to do functionally and break your software. So it's almost a denial of service type of thing. But then there's the other nefarious use, which could be a very long game indeed. There's the story of, I think it was called The Cuckoo's Nest, a story with regards to modems in the 70s and the infiltration of a US university. I think it might have been Berkeley, and somebody noticing that a modem light was on and then chasing the tail of what was causing that modem light to be on, and realizing it was actually a hacker from may have been Lithuania, somewhere in the Eastern Bloc, near the Iron Curtain at the time, working on behalf of the KGB and taking over and breaking into systems run by DARPA and NASA and actually causing harm and selling secrets back to the Soviet Union at the time. Now, that's, a very long-winded way of saying that there's a long way between the symptom and the cause. Yeah. Now, with software dependencies and open source, the Stuxnet virus, worm, where, let's say, the CIA infiltrated Iranian nuclear ambitions.
When you
with
say
regards
let's say,
to,
you mean they did, or you say let's say?
I think it's fairly well documented that they almost certainly did. Not that they will ever admit to as much, but the point I guess I'm making is that if there's a really long game and someone can obfuscate a single connection to the internet or some slightly obfuscated code that will carry out something slightly different from what you thought it was doing and you haven't reviewed it all, then, state agencies and the state of geopolitics at the moment, you could well imagine that there are bad actors in the world that would well want to take advantage of open source software, both at the kernel of the cloud industry, the infrastructure that we all rely on. I'm just a paranoid person worrying about the world at this point, but yes.
It's sort of an interesting dichotomy, because the openness of open source gives you the ability to spot things like that because they're in the open. But if they're done very subtly by someone who is obviously, seems to be in good standing in the community, then it may not even be noticed by anyone, and the opportunity to contribute is much wider. But many of that, as I say again, many of those problems could apply with closed source software as well.
Absolutely.
You infiltrate an employee and get them to do it, and then there's even less people who can review that code, and even more potential risk because none of the users of it can review it. So
I guess it's a bit of that case of, with any technology, it's a knife edge. You literally have the ability to do good and harm with the same thing. And we undoubtedly rely on the good of open source, because nobody is going to write a kernel for every single software project and work out the opcode required in their own compiler, so that they are going to be leaning on an enormous mountain of software, not just the packages written for your particular software stack, but the entire cloud infrastructure and all the orchestration that lives
it's open source all the way down, isn't it?
which is absolutely brilliant. It means you can get things done that you would never dream of being able to do as an individual. You could start a company and do all sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly.
But on the flip side of it, the surface area of what to assure and what to worry about is absolutely immense.
And it also depends on what you're using that open source for. I think one of the things we were mentioning, we were chatting about earlier, was the kind of, there's using it as a software dependency in the software you are producing as a development team. There's depending on it in your infrastructure, so it's the operating system you're running on your compute, or it's using open source tooling to achieve an aim, and that they've all got different aspects to it, and they've all got different risks and different benefits, and some of those I think work better than others, don't they, in terms of being
I think there's definitely patterns that you would use in each of those spaces. So in the software supply, when you're building your software, you would have maybe Dependabot or version library checkers that would comment or raise PRs in the best case to actually mitigate known CVE security threats. But you're right, it goes further than that to exploits and worries about the software that's orchestrating your software and the software that's run as part of an operating system or an image that then runs your software. So
I think you're right, where if you're producing IP using other software and you're using specific things that give you a leg up to get to that IP faster, you're also highly more likely to be assuring the things you're writing over the top of that. So therefore there'll be like a level of assurance, like you just mentioned. There's like, oh, well, let's do some code scanning and analysis, static analysis of stuff. Like you've got processes baked in for other reasons, not just a supply chain, but also for your own quality of the code that you produce it. When it's a tool that you don't necessarily have a process around other than consuming, then that's a little bit different, because there is no Dependabot process at that point on that code, because it's a binary that
a version of a tool.
It's a version of a tool, and you don't really know, and there isn't really even a step in that for you to necessarily know.
It's interesting because a tool is literally outside most of the things. You've got a vendor or a publisher, and it may or may not be open source. And if it's open source, you're assuming a degree of assurance or credibility, and having to layer on that trust.
The community, in quotes, will have done that,
Yep.
obviously.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
a binary of an open source tool. Of course, it has been
Absolutely.
assured by someone, surely.
Yeah, it's been
Obviously.
used everywhere. What are you talking about?
Yeah,
Of course
yeah.
it's fine.
The whole industry is relying on it.
It's fine.
And there's absolutely no threat factor where their open source software could be attacked to attack the world.
Yeah.
And my paranoia gets over me again.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you are right, there's fundamental differences on like how you're operating as a company and then consuming, and then when you're just using and you don't really have a process necessarily around it, and then how do you assure the usage of a tool? Like, I'm using this in my CI system, and I pull down this container, and then it runs a thing, and it like, do you know what I mean? And in that, it's got secrets because it needs permissions to go off to talk to an API, to go and perform some actions, and so then you're like, all right, what is that tool that's in that CI
That's got access
container?
to the secret.
Often quite destructive actions that it can do
exactly.
with those secrets. Yeah, it's
And they're like, hey, what checked that exactly? Or what assurance was around that thing in that step that just occurred that did all these things that had access to the secret? So you're like, open source.
it's fine. It'll all be
Exactly.
fine.
What are you talking about?
And and with the tool case, you get Is that kind of? I think there's a different model about the encouragement to contribute in those things as well, which may actually get more eyes on the code if more people contributing. Obviously, if you're using something as a library in your code, particularly if you're using a language like Go, you render the code in, and it's there. It's on your disk. You can see it. You can navigate into it with your IDE. You can see the code, and you can, if something's not right about it or you need an extra functionality about it, it almost encourages you to go open that PR, contribute to the community, do something, fix something. Yeah. As soon as you start using something as a tool rather than a software dependency, that it kind of drops away. There's more impedance between you contributing from it, and I don't think companies that put a lot of their IP is based off on top of open source software that they're using, they're not great about having models to contribute back to those things in many ways. And I think particularly in tooling, as HashiCorp have just sort of found and tried to change their licensing model to reflect the fact that the people that were using it were not contributing back to a level they were happy with. So they've kind of gone down this model of changing the license to try and get a different way of monetizing that, because they're not getting the contribution to make it work as a community-led effort.
Well, that's if the endeavour was for that, I guess.
That's a very fair point.
Was the endeavour to get loads of contribution, or was there a monetization strategy around it that didn't quite... could you monetize it enough for yourself, and was there a monetization strategy around open source? I think they're quite different. I think the thing within the tools is they're not designed in some ways, even though they are under the guise of like contribution, they're more... We've kind of identified a problem and solved a problem. It's akin more to like freeware than it is to open source, right? When it gets to like DevOps tooling, and I think you're right. When it's libraries, you might end up functionally thinking of something like, oh, that library's great, and I'm going to use it, and you're like, oh, it'd be so much better though if it could do this, because I'm trying to do this. And rather than me then go off and then maybe write another library that's very similar almost, but just enhances, I'll probably contribute because I've already used it, and that feels a little bit more natural, versus I'm not part of that process of the solution when you're coming up with a tool. That all happened behind closed doors. You kind of went off on your own tangent. It didn't really involve anybody. There isn't really a good known, but so therefore people feel more, I'll raise issues against it instead, because I don't really know. Well, I could contribute, but who knows if you'll even accept it. Is that aligned to the direction you're trying to take as an open source tool? So
the recent example, we've started using Cucumber testing. Nothing new there for a lot of our stuff, and in Go, the sort of idiomatic library to use is GoDog, sort of the Cucumber Foundation's own Go library that they have adopted and
by Datadog.
No, it was originally by Datadog, yeah, absolutely. But it's now it was contributed to the Cucumber organization, so it's now they gave it to them. So integrated with that, opened a couple of pull requests, and it was very interesting looking through. There was quite a lot of issues raised, and they were things that we've hit too, and then relatively straightforward fixes for them. Raise the pull request, sort of get it in, but then you notice that one of the issues that's open is, can we have some more maintainers? As I say, that kind of lack of enough of a community, and this has got several hundred stars. It's got several hundred forks. This is not a dead repo. It's got releases coming out, but nevertheless, a project of that scale used by that many other people to end up with that many forks of it. There's obviously a large community of people using it, and yet still can't find enough maintainers to review the pull requests even when they come in. And that's harder then from a contributor's point of view. You open the pull request and it just sits there. It's a very hard thing to be like, hi, would you mind? This basically fixes these 3 issues that you've got in your thing that are just open issues. Here's a pull request that fixes them. Would you mind just ticking the box so at least the pull request workflow could run? And then you're like, but you see, like, they're just individuals. They're not. There's no company sponsoring those people, so you're reliant on the goodwill of individuals to get that done and move the people forward. So what should we be doing as an industry, as commercial players in this space, to help situations like that, to better support these open source projects that do provide value to us as companies?
I'm just trying to think what are the software projects that that sort of getting away from the pure software stack, and you kind of went to the BDD tooling, which is kind of on the way to the sort of DevOps tooling sort of SRE type land of things. But I guess when a project is cool enough, it seems to be. I'm just trying to think: is there another way, another reason?
Think there is.
But
I think
you know,
the
you
license, change the license. I think what you could say is if you are a corporate company that is using this, there's a level of contribution we expect. Maybe that isn't financial, right? And it could be that, you know, if you're raising an issue or enough issues that you should become a maintainer of this as well, and therefore we don't have to like hunt for maintainers, and actually your company that is now a consumer should give up X percentage of some resource time to also kind of help and maintain, and maybe they could be very hard to enforce. But so is any license. Like paying for it is hard to enforce.
I mean, GPL is very hard to enforce, but it's wildly
there.
successful license.
Exactly. So maybe there is something that isn't always financial. Maybe there's like some give back in the license for like companies. Because in the end, it's a lot of companies using the software, not so much individuals in their own. I mean, there will be, but probably less so much. Probably more.
I agree entirely in your sentiment that a license is the way of declaring to the world what's fair and right and just and legal, potentially. But I doubt the reality and the human nature behind actually acting on a license or reading the license and knowing that that's a thing that you're meant to be doing.
Well, that's true, because people, when they announced the Terraform license change, everyone knew.
I guess there's big
when it suddenly
license
changed,
types.
everybody talked about the license change, and so I don't know. Like it feels like people do respond to it. Otherwise, everyone would be like, yeah, whatever.
And you look at the amount of engineer time that has been pledged to the open source equivalent of Terraform now. The Open Tofu. Yeah, there's a huge amount of engineering time contributed to that, which I imagine must be an interesting emotional thing for HashiCorp to look at. Couldn't you have helped before? I don't know.
Exactly. I'm just wondering if there was a tofu business that was also like, we're open tofu. What just happened? And then all of a sudden, like getting loads of hits somewhere. I don't know. There's already a company that does tofu that was an open tofu company.
I guess the thing I was musing on was, is there a difference between the type of project with regards to, you know, its mass adoption and how many people depend on it, to how many people would like to contribute or actually further their career notoriety or their businesses notoriety in having, you know, employees contribute to it.
But I think that's what the point of the license, though, because if you're assuming that the majority of the people that are in engineering are probably working for companies, and the assumption is that they're trying to find software that helps them do their job more than just to do personal endeavors, then you're already into the licensed element at that point. So then you're like, well, actually then, is it not some legal obligation for a company or a corporate company that's endorsing open source software by their engineers that work for them? Should you not have a policy that says, you know, if you're using open source in this company, people have to contribute, and therefore, because otherwise they won't. They'll be like, I'm not measured on contribution to open source. I'm measured on the features of the business because that's the company I work for.
Is there a license type that you're thinking of? Because
totally
I would imagine,
absolutely,
because I imagine in quite a lot. Most people won't read the license end to end. Obviously, there are people that would do that. And people would stand on the shoulders of those people. But I would say generally the license types are well known and people would get to know the details of that. So, John, make a new license type and we'll all contribute to all the open source.
Yeah.
There's also tooling that can help identify licenses that you've vended into your code.
Exactly.
Using those in
compliance
NPM checks and things like that for your, you know, you pulled in or Java was notorious for pulling in billions of different jars. That you depend on the universe. One of those could be GPL'd, in which case you need to open source your entire code base. So tools exist for legal compliance reasons to check those things. So the technical implementation of how you check compliance is plausible to do.
Like a little ticker that's like, you've got 30 days to contribute to this open source before it self-destructs. And I see it in the CI system every day ticking down. Everyone panicking.
Some nefarious library. Some nefarious library that you can't get to the bottom of. Somewhere in this code it's going to disable itself and I can't find it. It's open source. I should be able to control it.
Please. It could be like self-enforcing GPL. If you don't contribute within a certain time frame, it uploads all of your code onto GitHub with a GPL license.
You become open source.
Exactly. You open source your company. Yeah.
By name. Oh dear. It is kind of, I guess, getting back on the how much it's used, phones and things like that. When you were talking about nefarious tasks and long games and like political endeavours and that type of stuff, it does feel like, I mean, if you were minded that way, it does feel exceptionally opportunistically easy. Bearing in mind how much everything relies on software now, like insane amounts, isn't it? Like everything, and platforms and phones and watches and personal data of everything, and like literally just everywhere. So if you were to think about targeting something, it probably would make sense.
I mean, I'm not overly paranoid, but I do worry about that, and especially in the world we're in today with the geopolitical motivations of certain actors and paid for poor security, poor software developers who can't get funding for their crucial library that's at the heart of the entire internet, and they just happen to be living in a territory that neighbours some nefarious state that wants to take advantage and pay them a lot of money to put a certain payload at a certain time, 15 years down the line, who knows? I mean, and then with a dose of AI and the ability to generate these, well, maybe it will never get there because it will just hallucinate. But there's the thought that it's getting closer. It's getting closer, and certainly want to have my paranoid hat sort of corrected. But
it's fine if it's made by AI. It will look right. It will be plausible. It looks like it will do what it says, but when you actually try and compile it, it won't actually work because it's just nonsense.
I mean, having used it for a while, I can't agree more. But I would never say never.
Development, though, you're talking about, I guess, at that.
I guess when you're using an interactive capability to hallucinate on demand and sometimes be useful with unit tests and sometimes drive you bats a week later while you're trying to work out why the thing unit tested the wrong thing.
Imagine other products though using it, and then it's like, and then you start to trust it. It knows your voice. It's got voice recognition, and you're like, talking to whoever, Alexa or something, or Barclays, and you're like, can you transfer X amount of money to so-and-so? And then it just wires it to itself, or like some bank account somewhere else, or whatever's going on behind the scenes. You're like, oh, it got infiltrated.
I'm going to go back to my first point. That's much more of a risk with closed source than it is with open source.
But that's what I mean. It would at least someone could look over the open source.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? Because it's never nothing closed source does not use open source. Pretty much, I'd be very surprised.
Yeah. So I mean, even the whole of Windows is built on top of the Berkeley software network stack from 1980 something. So it's
all like it all tells all the way down, isn't it? Really, to some degree, because it's like, so that's, I mean, it's kind of intriguing because it's so much implicit trust. Maybe rightly so, and I'm ignorant to that level of trust somehow, but it does feel quite... It's just bizarre sometimes when you don't really think about it because you just do it.
Yeah.
And then you suddenly just clock it and you just think, wow, isn't that radical that all of this is being used everywhere? Open is being used absolutely everywhere for so many things that are so important, and we're just... Like no one really enjoyed. Or did they know?
I really enjoyed the movie Die Hard 4.0, which was all about this issue in a very, very crazy sort of pretend way. But it was.
I didn't even know there was a Die Hard.
There was a Die Hard 4.0. And
do you have to say the 4.0?
You do, and that was the point they were making, because it was basically a play on software vulnerabilities and a nefarious takeover of the world, and let's take over all the cell phone systems and the hydroelectric systems and the grid and all the rest of it, and play that out with, obviously, a bit of guns. And
did that start with a pull request to an open source repo?
I think it actually did. I think it probably did. Yeah, Bruce Willis wasn't the main actor in that part of the story, but
some developer writing Coney walks in with a vest.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, suddenly through a window, smashes through the window on a motorbike in a vest. And they're just like doing a PR.
There's probably been slightly closer to real sort of stories about that. I refer you back to the Cuckoo's Nest, and I'll leave it there.
we all want to be that cool, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. Like, that needs a peer review. As he like smashes through the window.
You can't merge that without resolving the comments.
Yeah, exactly. It's a new way of
Oh my
developing.
god, I'm reliving my day with Mark's reviewing my comments.
Wasn't there a film on Netflix about a similar thing where all the Tesla cars get taken over or something? Was it you telling me that? I haven't watched it.
What was it called? I can't remember what it's called, but yes, it was all about the end of the world. Oh, Leave the World Behind. That was it.
Oh right.
That
in a Tesla.
It wasn't. I mean, it was great because they infiltrated. I think that one by the way they posed that bit of the storyline, or the Tesla factory was clearly overrun, and all the Teslas were brand new and were all driving themselves to block all the highways. But the planes were also all dropping out of the sky, so we blame Boeing as well. And then all of the hydroelectric plants and all the bio risks were all going down as well. So it was an interesting thing, but there's going to be a lot of storytelling in this space, I'd imagine.
Yeah. To be fair, we live in North London near me. Yeah. All the roads are blocked permanently anyway. Because of basically what they've managed to do. You're not allowed to go down any of the roads apart from one.
You don't need an end of the
nowadays,
world scenario.
That's London for you.
It's a different kind of risk we're building up with these things. Like Tesla's an obvious one. It always plays through my mind, speaking of closed source, the Tesla operating system and cloud thing, that it's all connected together. If Tesla disappeared or chose not to support your car anymore, does your car stop working? I mean, you bought the car. You didn't buy a license for the car. You bought the car.
I mean, you could say
all these internet connected devices we've got, powered by open source, ironically, but then reliant on closed cloud services to exist and work. It feels like a huge risk. Like everyone's taking when they buy almost any product, a washing machine, a car, it's a battery for your house.
Yeah. I mean, you could put the Tesla sticker on it because it's fun
it's
to bash, but like literally, you're right. All software in all devices these days, your TV to your phone to your anti-lock brakes on your Tesla, or whether it be your my one wheel
washing machine. I don't think so. I think that's the difference. Like the washing machine doesn't start trying to run you over.
No, but when you're in a vehicle,
or maybe in the future, who knows?
Yeah.
And my washing machine's pretty smart. It won't let you turn it on remotely if you haven't closed the door and pressed the special button.
Oh, there you go.
And so if you want to get in the washing machine yourself and then start it from your phone, you can't do it unless you press the button on the outside.
Stops you getting in it.
It's sort of they've thought about the risk of you accidentally starting it with someone in your washing machine, I suppose. So
yeah, but it's not long until they all start talking to each other. And
then planning to wash your child or whatever.
Exactly. It won't take long. Anyway, that ended on a very bizarre note, but I don't think we're ever going to conclude it other than probably all the tools that we kind of mentioned, and security scanning and software supply chaining and putting it in your processes as much as possible. And if you're using open source tools, a little bit trickier, but probably scanning and doing some assurance on the things you're pulling in. But
security in depth is the thing that people keep saying, and it's very boring, but cover all the things paranoidly all the way down, depending on your budget and reward.
I think the other thing I'd say is people who are taking these tools with them, open source, company to company, think about contributing back to those things. Build a community around them so there's more eyes on the tools you're using. You're recommending to everyone, and particularly in the DevOps space, there's a lot of bringing your favorite set of tools. It's something that John was mentioning earlier. It's how do you? Are you contributing back? Are you actually being part of building that thing, or are you just sort of, almost virtue signaling by using open source? I don't know.
It's a little bit like that. But then after you finish work, get your phone, get in your Tesla, drive off, don't worry about it. Forget all about it, it's all fine. Anyway, it's good fun having you on, and until next time, I guess. Cheers.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.